There exists in the rust-colored hills of southeastern Turkey a place that should not exist. A monument so thoroughly incompatible with everything we have been taught about human history that its very presence feels like a glitch in the matrix of time. A cosmic typo written in limestone and secrets that refuses to be erased no matter how many textbooks we rewrite or how many comfortable narratives we construct to explain it away. Göbekli Tepe rises from the earth like a stone confession, its massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles that predate pottery, predate agriculture, predate the wheel, and predate everything we once believed was necessary for human beings to accomplish anything more ambitious than following game animals across the plains and hoping for good weather. The archaeological establishment discovered this impossible place in 1963, though discovered seems too gentle a word for what actually happened, which was more like stumbling into a room that wasn't supposed to exist in a house you thought you knew completely, only to realize that the foundations go deeper than you ever imagined, and the blueprints you've been working from are either incomplete or deliberately misleading. For decades, the site was dismissed as nothing more than a medieval cemetery, a convenient categorization that allowed everyone to sleep soundly without confronting the implications, until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived in 1994 with fewer assumptions and more curiosity than his predecessors, beginning excavations that would ultimately force us to reconsider not just when civilization began, but whether we have any idea what the word civilization actually means. What Schmidt and his team unearthed defies the comfortable progression we teach in schools, that neat little ladder of human development where hunter-gatherers gradually become farmers who eventually build villages that slowly evolve into cities with temples and kings and tax collectors. Göbekli Tepe laughs at this narrative with the cruel amusement of someone who knows a joke you haven't figured out yet. Because here, 11,600 years ago, people who supposedly lacked every prerequisite for monumental construction somehow carved pillars weighing up to 16 tons from bedrock, transported them across distances that would challenge modern equipment, erected them in precisely planned circular arrangements, and decorated them with elaborate reliefs of animals both familiar and strange, all executed with an artistic sophistication that suggests not tentative first attempts, but the confident hand of established tradition. The pillars themselves stand like silent witnesses to a crime we cannot name, their T-shaped forms vaguely humanoid, as though representing beings or ancestors or gods whose faces have been deliberately left blank, forcing everyone who looks upon them to project their own fears and hopes and questions onto those smooth, limestone surfaces, where eyes should be. Some pillars display carved arms and hands, positioned as though these stone giants are attending an eternal gathering, a council frozen in time, and the animals depicted across their surfaces, foxes, lions, bulls, serpents, scorpions, vultures, seem to writhe with a vitality that makes you wonder if the carvers were depicting a bestiary or recording something else entirely, some symbolic language we can no longer read because the dictionary was burned before we learned the alphabet. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Göbekli Tepe, the detail that should haunt anyone who considers it seriously, is that the people who built it chose to bury it, deliberately filling in the entire complex with thousands of tons of earth and debris, entombing their magnificent creation as carefully as they had constructed it, like someone taking their life's work, the thing they poured decades of collective effort into creating, and locking it in a vault before throwing away the key. Imagine if tomorrow, by unanimous decision, humanity decided to bury every skyscraper, fill every subway tunnel with concrete, dismantle every satellite, and return to living in wooden structures lit by candles, and you begin to approach the magnitude of this decision. Though even that comparison fails because we would be abandoning technology. We understand, while the Göbekli builders buried knowledge, whose full significance we can only guess at through the shadows it casts across the millennia. This act of deliberate burial suggests a level of intentionality that makes the site even more mysterious. Because things we value we preserve, things we fear we destroy, but things we bury carefully, reverently, with the kind of systematic attention displayed at Göbekli Tepe. Those are things we want to hide while simultaneously wanting them to survive. Messages in bottles thrown into the ocean of time with the desperate hope that someone, someday, might find them and understand what we could not preserve through words or traditions or living memory. The question that crawls into your mind and refuses to leave is simple yet terrifying in its implications. What were they trying to tell us? Or perhaps more accurately, what were they trying to tell themselves? Knowing that forgetting was inevitable, but hoping that remembering might still be possible, if they just made the memory solid enough, heavy enough, permanent enough to outlast the coming darkness. Modern dating techniques using optically stimulated luminescence and radiocarbon analysis place the oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe around 9600 BCE, a date so impossibly early that when it was first proposed, many archaeologists simply refused to believe it, because accepting it meant accepting that everything they thought they knew about the Neolithic Revolution was at best incomplete and at worst fundamentally wrong. This was the era we call the pre-pottery Neolithic A time when humans supposedly lived in small, mobile groups, following seasonal patterns of hunting and gathering, lacking the social organization, surplus resources, and technological capabilities required to undertake projects of this scale and ambition. Yet here stands the evidence that they not only could, but did, suggesting that either our timeline is wrong, our understanding of societal development is wrong, or something essential about the people who built Göbekli Tepe is wrong in ways we haven't yet identified. The site covers approximately 22 acres, though only a tiny fraction has been excavated, meaning that what we have discovered so far might represent merely the prologue to a much longer story still buried beneath the earth, waiting with the patience that only stone possesses. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetic surveys suggest at least 20 additional circular structures remain underground, each potentially holding new revelations or deeper mysteries. And the truly maddening aspect is that we may never excavate them all because the Turkish government has quite reasonably decided that preservation matters more than our curiosity, leaving future generations to continue the work or perhaps to ask better questions than we have managed to formulate. The construction techniques themselves speak to capabilities that seem anachronistic for the period, because moving 16-ton pillars without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals, requires not just muscle, but sophisticated understanding of leverage, friction, logistics, and coordinated group effort sustained over years or possibly decades. Try to imagine organizing several hundred people who have no tradition of taking orders, no concept of hierarchical authority, no writing system to record plans or track progress, no agricultural surplus to feed the workers, and no previous experience with construction projects of any kind. And then ask yourself how they managed to create something that looks like it required all those things and more, and you begin to glimpse the depth of the problem Göbekli Tepe presents to conventional historical narratives. Some researchers have proposed that the site served as a ceremonial center, a temple complex that drew pilgrims from surrounding regions, which would explain the apparent lack of permanent habitation. but raises its own questions about what kind of religion or ideology could motivate such extraordinary effort from people who supposedly had more pressing concerns like finding their next meal. Others suggest it functioned as an astronomical observatory, noting alignments with celestial bodies and seasonal events, though this explanation feels incomplete because surely there are easier ways to track the stars than carving them into multi-ton pillars arranged in concentric circles that take generations to complete. What if, instead of a temple or an observatory or a meeting place, Göbekli Tepe represented something our modern categories cannot easily accommodate? A library without books, an archive without writing, a repository of knowledge encoded in stone and symbol and spatial relationships, built by people who knew that words would be forgotten and traditions would fade, but stone, properly placed and meaningfully arranged, might survive long enough to whisper secrets to distant descendants who had learned to ask the right questions. This interpretation, admittedly speculative yet strangely compelling, reframes the entire structure as an act of desperate preservation rather than religious devotion, a last-ditch effort to pass something crucial forward across an abyss of time and catastrophe, like a parent writing instructions for their children, knowing that the children might not be able to read, but hoping they will at least understand that the writing matters. The animal imagery that adorns the pillars takes on new significance when viewed through this lens, because if you wanted to communicate across the barrier of lost language and dead cultures, you would use images that remained constant: predators and prey, dangerous creatures and useful ones, the fox and the snake and the vulture that would look essentially the same to your descendants 11,000 years later, unlike kings or gods or abstract concepts that might mean nothing to people whose entire worldview had shifted. The arrangements might encode astronomical data, seasonal migrations, flood cycles, or warnings about dangers both terrestrial and cosmic. A stone-carved manual for rebuilding after everything falls apart, written by people who had perhaps already witnessed or inherited stories of such falling apart, and were determined not to let it happen again without leaving some trace, some clue, some possibility of recovery. This brings us to the most disturbing possibility that Göbekli Tepe quietly suggests through its impossible existence and deliberate burial, which is that the people who built it were not pioneers, but inheritors. Not the first to achieve civilization, but perhaps among the last survivors of something older, tasked with preserving whatever fragments they could salvage from a catastrophe we can only dimly perceive through geological evidence and mythological memory. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 10,800 BCE, multiple comet fragments struck the Earth, triggering rapid climate change, widespread wildfires, and the extinction of numerous species. And while this theory remains controversial among mainstream scientists, it would explain why people who supposedly had no reason to build monuments suddenly felt compelled to do so with seemingly impossible urgency. Because when your world ends and you realize your children might forget everything you know, you build something that cannot be forgotten, even if its meaning becomes obscure. Consider the timeline carefully, letting its implications settle into your understanding, like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still lake. Because Göbekli Tepe's construction begins roughly 800 years after the proposed impact event, which is almost exactly the length of time between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the present day, long enough for detailed knowledge to fragment into legend, for sophisticated understanding to decay into ritual, for the how and why of things to separate completely, until you have people performing actions whose original purpose has been entirely forgotten, yet whose importance is somehow still felt in the bones and blood of cultural memory. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were like medieval monks copying Roman texts they could no longer fully comprehend, preserving forms whose functions had been lost, building according to principles they remembered but no longer truly understood, creating something magnificent precisely because they knew it might be the last chance to bridge the gap between what was and what might still be. The deliberate burial of the site around 8000 BCE, more than a millennium after its construction, suggests a conscious decision to seal away this knowledge. And you have to wonder what combination of fear, resignation, or strategic thinking would lead a society to hide rather than simply abandon or destroy. Perhaps they recognized that holding on to inherited wisdom they could not fully utilize was becoming a burden rather than a blessing, that the effort required to maintain and interpret these stone archives was draining resources needed for survival in changing times. Or perhaps they understood something more subtle and more frightening, that knowledge without context is dangerous, that inheriting tools you don't understand leads to cargo cults and misapplications that can be worse than starting fresh with clear-eyed ignorance. Now, here we stand, 11,000 years later, excavating their carefully buried secret and struggling to understand what it means. And the irony should not escape us that we are doing to Göbekli Tepe exactly what its builders might have hoped. Uncovering their message, puzzling over their symbols, trying desperately to reconstruct what they knew and why they thought it mattered enough to preserve in stone, while simultaneously hiding it from their immediate descendants. We are the distant children they wrote to, and the tragic comedy is that we can barely read the letter, can barely comprehend the urgency that moved them to such extraordinary effort, because we too are inheritors of things we don't fully understand, users of technologies whose principles we accept without grasping, believers in narratives that might be as incomplete as whatever stories the Göbekli builders told themselves about why they were doing what they were doing. If Göbekli Tepe represents a civilization trying to pass knowledge forward across the abyss of catastrophe and forgetting, then we must ask what knowledge they were trying to preserve, what they deemed so essential that it warranted this monumental effort, and most unsettling of all, whether they succeeded or failed in their mission. And if they failed, whether we are doomed to repeat their failure, because the thing about inherited knowledge is that you can receive it without recognizing it, can hold the answer in your hands without understanding the question, can stand in the presence of the message and mistake it for decoration, because the context that would make it meaningful has long since crumbled to dust and blown away on winds that stopped blowing before your grandparents' grandparents learned to count. The question of how knowledge survives catastrophe is not merely academic or theoretical, but represents one of the most urgent and practical challenges facing any civilization that has accumulated enough understanding to recognize its own fragility. And if you want to comprehend why the builders of Göbekli Tepe might have chosen stone circles over written records, monument over manuscript, you need only conduct a simple thought experiment that reveals the terrifying vulnerability of everything we consider permanent in our modern world. Imagine that tomorrow, through some combination of solar flare, electromagnetic pulse, or cascading infrastructure failure, every electronic device on Earth simultaneously ceased functioning, taking with it not just our entertainment and communication systems, but the vast majority of human knowledge that exists now, primarily or exclusively in digital form, stored on servers and hard drives and cloud networks that would become instantly inaccessible, leaving behind a generation that can use smartphones but cannot repair them, that relies on GPS but cannot navigate by stars, that trusts algorithms but cannot perform the calculations those algorithms execute invisibly and instantaneously thousands of times per second. In such a scenario, which is far less apocalyptic than what the Göbekli builders might have faced, the degradation of knowledge would not happen all at once in a dramatic bonfire of learning, but would instead occur gradually, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, as specialists died without passing on their expertise, as the complex supply chains required to manufacture microprocessors dissolved into simpler economies of immediate survival, as the collective understanding of how our technological world actually functions fragmented into increasingly mythologized stories about the time before the darkness fell. Within a single generation, much of what we consider basic literacy in the modern world, the ability to code, to troubleshoot computer systems, to understand networking protocols, would become rare, specialized knowledge held by an aging population whose students might learn the rituals of technology without grasping the underlying principles. Cargo cults, pressing buttons that no longer connect to anything, performing ceremonies that once yielded results, but now produce only the hollow satisfaction of maintaining tradition. This is precisely the situation that any civilization facing collapse must confront if it wishes to pass something meaningful forward to its descendants. Because the nature of complex knowledge is that it exists not in individual minds, but in networks of expertise, in institutions and libraries and laboratories, in the collective intelligence that emerges when thousands of specialists can communicate freely and build upon each other's work. And when those networks dissolve, when communication breaks down and institutions crumble and specialists scatter to focus on immediate survival, the knowledge doesn't simply transfer to a new medium, but evaporates like water in the desert sun, leaving behind only the residue of what once was, crystallized fragments that hint at but cannot reconstitute the original solution. The Göbekli builders, if they were indeed inheritors of an earlier civilization's collapse, would have understood this process intimately, would have watched as their parents and grandparents spoke of wonders that grew less detailed with each retelling, until the specifics blurred into mythology, and the mythology hardened into ritual, and the ritual became simply the way things are done, without anyone remembering why. The archaeological evidence from the transition period between the Younger Dryas and the early Holocene reveals a pattern consistent with cultural inheritance under stress, with populations scattered and reduced, with technological regression in some areas, accompanied by puzzling sophistication in others, with what appears to be the preservation of specific practices whose original context has been lost. Rather like how medieval European monks meticulously copied Roman texts in Latin without understanding the language well enough to appreciate what they were preserving, maintaining the form while the function slipped away into the obscurity of dead empires and forgotten purposes. Göbekli Tepe emerges from this context not as an inexplicable anomaly, but as a logical response to an intolerable situation. If you know that forgetting is inevitable, if you've witnessed the dissolution of complex knowledge within living memory, if you understand that oral traditions decay and written records burn, and institutional memory requires institutions that might not survive, then encoding essential information in the most durable medium available becomes not just sensible but desperately necessary. A last attempt to throw a rope across the chasm of time, separating what was from what might be again. Modern civilization, despite its confidence in its own permanence, has periodically recognized the same problem and attempted to address it through what we might call inheritance protocols, deliberate efforts to communicate across vast stretches of time with recipients whose language, culture, and fundamental worldview might be completely alien to our own. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in the permafrost of Eyre. Norwegian Island represents one such attempt, a recognition that the botanical knowledge encoded in thousands of plant species could be lost through war, climate change, or simple agricultural homogenization, and that preserving the physical seeds themselves offers better odds of recovery than relying on databases and documentation that might not survive the very catastrophes that make the vault necessary. The designers of this modern monument to human foresight chose cold, isolation, and geological stability, essentially the same criteria that might have guided the Göbekli builders in their choice of location and construction method, though separated by 11 millennia and countless theoretical advances in how to preserve information for the future. Even more telling is the WIP, Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, where the United States government stores radioactive waste that will remain dangerous for 10,000 years, a time span that exceeds recorded human history and requires warning future humans about dangers they might not be able to detect or understand, leading to the creation of the Permanent Markers Implementation Plan, which grapples with the same fundamental problem faced by the Göbekli builders. How do you communicate essential information to people whose language you don't speak, whose symbols you cannot predict, whose entire civilization might be built on assumptions completely different from your own? The proposed solutions include multiple redundant warning systems, messages in multiple languages including pictograms, landscape modifications visible from space, and the creation of an atomic priesthood that would pass down warnings through ritual and tradition across the generations, essentially acknowledging that when you're communicating across truly vast timescales, you need to encode your message not just in text or image, but in myth, ceremony, and physical monuments that resist both natural decay and human interference. The parallels to Göbekli Tepe become impossible to ignore when you consider that the ancient site employs many of these same strategies. Massive stone structures that resist weathering, symbolic imagery that doesn't depend on linguistic knowledge, astronomical alignments that remain constant across millennia, and most intriguingly, the creation of what appears to be a ceremonial or ritual space that might have been intended to generate exactly the kind of persistent cultural memory that the atomic priesthood proposal seeks to establish. If the builders were trying to preserve knowledge of astronomical cycles, climatic patterns, agricultural techniques, or warnings about recurring catastrophes, embedding that information in a sacred site that required regular pilgrimage and ritual observance would ensure that at least the practice of paying attention to these things survived, even if the detailed understanding faded, creating a structure that says, "This matters. Keep watching, keep remembering, keep coming back." Even when the specifics of what and why have slipped beyond the reach of living memory, the animal imagery carved into the pillars takes on new significance when viewed through this lens of deliberate, cross-temporal communication. Because unlike representations of gods or kings or political systems that might mean nothing to future cultures, animals provide a constant reference point, a shared vocabulary that remains stable across vast stretches of time, since the fox and the serpent and the vulture don't change their essential nature just because human civilizations rise and fall. The specific combinations of animals, their positions and relationships on the pillars might encode information in a symbolic language designed to be intuitive, even without instruction, operating on the principle that future humans would still recognize predator and prey, still understand dominance hierarchies, still see in the animal world a mirror of human concerns and cosmic patterns, and might therefore be able to decode messages written in this universal grammar of fang and wing and watchful eye. Consider also the astronomical alignments documented at Göbekli Tepe, where certain structures appear oriented towards significant celestial events, summer solstices and stellar positions that would have had both practical and symbolic importance to an agricultural or proto-agricultural society trying to time planting and harvesting or track the long cycles of climate and catastrophe. This kind of information doesn't require written language to transmit because the sky itself serves as the text, unchanging and universally accessible to anyone who learns to read it. And by embedding architectural alignments that direct attention towards specific celestial phenomena, the builders created a teaching tool that functions across the barrier of cultural discontinuity, a pointer that says, "Pay attention to this, it matters," without needing to explain in words why it matters or what you're supposed to do with the information once you notice it. The Voyager Golden Record launched into space in 1977, carrying sounds and images intended to represent Earth to any extraterrestrial intelligence that might encounter it, represents perhaps the most ambitious inheritance protocol ever attempted, trying to communicate not just across time but across the even more profound gap of potentially alien consciousness. And the designers faced exactly the same challenges that would have confronted the Göbekli builders. How do you convey meaning without shared language? How do you provide context when context itself is what's missing? How do you say, "This is important," in a way that transcends the specific cultural moment of creation? The solutions chosen for the Golden Record mirror remarkably closely what we see at Göbekli Tepe: mathematical and physical constants that should be universal, images of humans and animals and natural phenomena, symbolic representations of our place in the cosmos, all encoded in the most durable format available and designed with multiple layers of redundancy. Because when you're throwing a message into the void of time or space, you cannot afford to assume anything about your audience, except that they exist and that they're looking. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, rather than contradicting this interpretation of the site as an inheritance protocol, actually reinforces it in ways that become clear when you consider the life cycle of such protocols in the real world. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do with critical information is not to broadcast it continuously, but to preserve it safely until circumstances make its recovery and application possible again. Like the way the Svalbard seed vault is not meant to be accessed except in genuine emergency, or the way time capsules are buried with explicit instructions not to open until a specific future date. The builders might have recognized that maintaining the site actively across generations would require resources and organizational capacity they could no longer sustain. Or they might have concluded that the knowledge encoded in the structures was premature for a population that had regressed to simpler lifeways and needed to rebuild more fundamental capacities before attempting to recover what had been lost. Or perhaps, most intriguingly, they might have deliberately hidden the site to protect it from destruction or desecration during the unstable transitional period they anticipated, preserving it for a distant future when humans would have the archaeological sophistication to excavate carefully and the intellectual framework to ask meaningful questions about what they found. The concept of appropriate timing for knowledge recovery appears repeatedly in human traditions of hidden wisdom and sealed prophecies. The idea that certain information becomes dangerous if accessed too early, but valuable if discovered at the right developmental moment. And while we tend to dismiss such notions as mystical nonsense in our modern arrogance, they contain a practical insight about the relationship between knowledge and capacity that the Göbekli builders, struggling to preserve fragments of understanding that their immediate descendants might misuse or fail to maintain, would have grasped with painful clarity. You cannot give metallurgy to people who lack fuel for sustained fires, cannot teach calculus to students who haven't mastered arithmetic, cannot hand over nuclear physics to a civilization still fighting with stone axes. And if you've inherited knowledge that exceeds your own capacity to apply it responsibly or maintain it accurately, sometimes the wisest choice is to lock it away with clues sufficient for future generations who might be ready for what you cannot safely use. This same principle governs how we approach our own most dangerous knowledge today, with nuclear weapon designs, classified and contained not because we've forgotten how to build them, but because we recognize that widespread distribution of such information creates unacceptable risks, and with similar restrictions placed on synthetic biology techniques, artificial intelligence research, and other fields where the power to transform civilization outpaces our wisdom about how to wield that power safely, suggesting that the impulse to selectively restrict knowledge inheritance is not a failure of the Göbekli builders, but a recurring pattern of responsible civilizational behavior. The difference is that we maintain our restrictions through institutional force and legal frameworks, systems that depend on continuing social stability and governmental authority, while the builders had to work with what survives institutional collapse, stone, symbol, and the hope that burial equals preservation rather than merely prolonged forgetting. The tragic irony that emerges from this examination of inheritance protocols is that they succeed and fail simultaneously, because Göbekli Tepe did survive, did preserve itself across 11,000 years, did eventually yield its secrets to archaeological investigation, thereby validating the builders' faith in stone and strategic burial. Yet the knowledge they were trying to preserve, the actual content of their message beyond the bare fact of its existence, remains largely opaque to us, despite our advanced dating techniques and ground-penetrating radar and comparative mythology, proving that preserving the medium does not guarantee preserving the meaning, that you can inherit a message without being able to read it, that the rope thrown across the chasm of time might reach us without being strong enough to pull us back to understanding what was lost. We stand before their pillars like children who found a parent's diary written in a language we almost recognize, catching fragments of significance, sensing urgent importance, constructing elaborate theories about what it might mean, yet ultimately separated from the truth by the same gulf of cultural discontinuity that the builders were trying to bridge when they carved these stones and arranged them just so, and then, for reasons we can only speculate about, buried them carefully beneath tons of earth and debris. This failure of inheritance, or perhaps more accurately, this partial success that feels like failure because we want complete recovery, rather than tantalizing glimpses, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own inheritance protocols and whether they will fare any better across the chasms of time and catastrophe that the future undoubtedly holds. Because if the Göbekli builders failed to transmit their knowledge clearly, despite what appears to have been sophisticated understanding of how to encode information for long-term survival, what makes us think our seed vaults and warning markers and golden records will successfully communicate with our descendants 10,000 years hence? And more disturbing still, What makes us think we would recognize our own inherited knowledge if it arrived in forms we haven't learned to see, in patterns we mistake for coincidence, in monuments we classify as primitive rather than as the last desperate messages from people who knew more than we give them credit for? The question that propels us forward from this examination of how knowledge survives or fails to survive. Catastrophe is not whether the Göbekli builders succeeded in their inheritance protocol, because the answer is simultaneously yes and no, depending on whether you measure success by physical preservation or semantic transmission, but rather what they were actually trying to preserve, what information they deemed so crucial that it warranted this enormous investment of time and labor and collective will, and whether that knowledge survives anywhere in the world today, perhaps in forms so transformed by 11,000 years of cultural mutation that we fail to recognize its origin, fail to trace it back to those stone pillars standing in circles beneath the Turkish sky, fail to realize that what we think we invented might actually be what we inherited without knowing the source, making us all unwitting participants in an inheritance protocol that worked better than anyone could have predicted, precisely because it hid its own success beneath layers of apparent failure and forgetting. When you stand before the excavated circles of Göbekli Tepe and allow yourself to truly comprehend what you're seeing, not through the comfortable filter of academic categorization that labels everything a temple or ritual center when its actual purpose proves elusive, but through the unmediated recognition that this structure represents an investment of human effort that rivals or exceeds anything achieved by supposedly more advanced civilizations that came thousands of years later, you begin to understand that the conventional narrative of linear progress, from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from hunter-gatherer to agricultural society, contains fundamental errors that are not merely matters of timing or chronology, but reflect a deeper misunderstanding of what civilization actually is and what it requires. The pillars that form the concentric circles at Göbekli Tepe are not crude first attempts at monumental construction that would later be refined by more capable cultures, but rather demonstrate a level of planning, execution, and symbolic sophistication that suggests they represent either the culmination of a long, developmental process we haven't yet discovered, or the inheritance of techniques and knowledge from an earlier tradition that had already solved the basic engineering problems and established the symbolic vocabulary that the builders were working within. And either possibility fundamentally challenges the story we tell ourselves about human development and the necessary prerequisites for accomplishing great works. The engineering precision visible in the construction reveals capabilities that make archaeologists uncomfortable when they consider the implications honestly, because moving stones weighing 10 to 16 tons without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals, and without the accumulated experience of earlier monumental construction projects, requires not just brute force, but sophisticated understanding of leverage, friction coefficients, load distribution, and the coordination of large groups of workers in synchronized effort sustained over periods that would have tested the organizational capacity of most Bronze Age kingdoms. Consider the practical reality of what's involved in quarrying a 16-ton limestone pillar from bedrock using only stone tools, a process that would require thousands of hours of percussive labor by workers who needed to eat several times daily, and therefore represented a massive drain on whatever food resources the community could mobilize, then transporting that pillar across uneven terrain to the construction site without the benefit of wheeled vehicles or paved roads. A feat that, even with modern understanding of physics and mechanics, would challenge a team of engineers with access to contemporary equipment, and finally, erecting it vertically and securing it in position precisely enough that it has remained standing for 11,600 years through countless earthquakes, floods, and other geological events that have toppled mountains and rerouted rivers. The scale of labor involved becomes truly staggering when you multiply this effort across the dozens of pillars at just the excavated portions of the site, and then consider that ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 20 additional circular structures remain buried beneath the surrounding hillside, implying a construction project that would have occupied hundreds or possibly thousands of workers for decades or even generations, requiring a level of social organization and resource mobilization that supposedly didn't exist among hunter-gatherer populations who had no experience with settled life, no agricultural surplus to feed non-productive specialists, no hierarchical authority structures to coordinate complex group activities, and no previous tradition of monumental architecture to draw upon for techniques and inspiration. The standard archaeological explanation that Göbekli Tepe served as a ritual center that drew pilgrims from across the region, who contributed labor during seasonal gatherings between hunting and foraging activities, feels inadequate when you consider the precision and consistency of the construction, because occasional volunteer labor by rotating groups of unskilled workers doesn't produce the kind of uniform quality and systematic planning evident in the stonework, any more than asking random weekend volunteers to build a cathedral would result in anything resembling Gothic architecture. The symbolic complexity of the carved reliefs further complicates any attempt to dismiss the builders as primitive experimenters stumbling towards civilization through trial and error, because the animal imagery displays not just competent craftsmanship, but artistic sophistication that suggests established iconographic conventions, consistent symbolic meanings, and possibly even narrative sequences that we can no longer read because the cultural context that would make them meaningful has been lost to time. The pillars depict foxes, wild boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, lions, bulls, gazelles, and numerous other creatures, many shown in dynamic poses that convey movement and behavior rather than static representation, and the placement of these animals seems deliberate rather than decorative, with certain species appearing in consistent relationships or positions that hint at underlying patterns we haven't yet decoded, like finding a complex mathematical formula written in a notation system we don't recognize, and therefore can only appreciate for its aesthetic qualities, while missing entirely the functional information it contains. Particularly intriguing are the anthropomorphic elements incorporated into the T-shaped pillars themselves, with some displaying carved arms and hands positioned as though the stones represent stylized human or humanoid figures, attending an eternal gathering. Their blank surfaces where faces should be creating an eerie sense of deliberate anonymity that makes you wonder whether the builders were representing actual beings whose identities mattered less than their collective presence, or whether they were creating symbolic placeholders for concepts or forces that transcended individual personality, or whether perhaps most unsettlingly they were leaving those faces blank because to carve them would be to misrepresent or limit something that couldn't be adequately captured in stone, and was better left to imagination or personal interpretation. The hands themselves show remarkable anatomical detail with clearly defined fingers and thumbs, demonstrating that the blankness of the faces is not a limitation of skill, but a deliberate choice, which raises the question of what message or meaning this choice was meant to convey to viewers both contemporary and future, and whether we would understand that message even if we could somehow recover the builders' explicit explanations of their iconographic program. The circular arrangement of the pillars creates spaces that clearly served some communal or collective purpose, with the largest structures measuring up to 30 meters in diameter and featuring two massive central pillars that rise taller than the surrounding ring, suggesting hierarchical organization within the sacred or ceremonial space. And the consistent orientation of these structures toward specific astronomical phenomena indicates that whatever happened in these circles was coordinated with celestial events, seasonal changes, or cosmic cycles that the builders tracked with sufficient precision to align multi-ton stones accordingly. This astronomical dimension transforms the site from a mere gathering place into something more like a three-dimensional calendar or astronomical computer, where the positions of shadows, alignments of sight lines between pillars, and relationships between structure and sky would have encoded temporal information accessible to anyone who learned to read the architecture correctly, creating a system where knowledge of astronomical cycles didn't require written records or mathematical tables, but could be directly observed and verified through the physical arrangement of stone, which would survive cultural discontinuity and language change in ways that written documentation never could. The discovery of stone vessels, flint tools, and animal bones at Göbekli Tepe provides some insight into the practical activities that occurred at the site, though the interpretation of this evidence remains contentious among researchers who disagree about whether the site supported permanent occupation or served only as a ceremonial center visited periodically by mobile populations from surrounding regions. The animal bones include remains of gazelles, wild cattle, boars, and other game species that suggest feasting on a significant scale, which raises interesting questions about the relationship between ritual activity and food consumption, and whether what we categorize as religious ceremony might have served equally important functions in terms of information exchange, alliance formation, marriage arrangements, and the transmission of technical knowledge between groups that otherwise had limited contact, making the site less a temple in our modern understanding and more a critical node in a network of cultural and practical exchange that held together a much larger population than could be supported by any single locality. The comparative evidence from other sites in the region adds crucial context to understanding Göbekli Tepe's place in the broader pattern of Neolithic development, because it's not an isolated anomaly, but rather the most spectacular example of a cluster of roughly contemporary sites, including Karahan Tepe, Navalu Chori, and others that share similar architectural features, symbolic vocabularies, and construction techniques, suggesting that what we're seeing is not a single genius community, but a widespread cultural phenomenon that extended across southeastern Anatolia and possibly into northern Mesopotamia and the Levant. Karahan Tepe, located about 40 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, features similar T-shaped pillars, circular structures, and animal reliefs, though the style shows enough variation to indicate local traditions within a shared cultural framework rather than slavish copying of a single model, and the existence of multiple sites employing these techniques makes the engineering and organizational achievements even more remarkable because they suggest widespread distribution of sophisticated knowledge rather than concentration in a single, exceptional community. The global context becomes even more intriguing when you consider other megalithic sites whose construction dates have been pushed back through improved dating techniques, often over vigorous objections from archaeologists whose careers were built on earlier chronologies, creating a pattern where almost every time we develop better methods for determining when things were built, we discover they're older than we thought. And the implications of this consistent pattern should make us question whether our baseline assumptions about the timeline of human civilization might be systematically wrong in ways that push sophisticated construction and complex social organization further back into the past than current paradigms comfortably accommodate. The Sphinx enclosure at Giza, for example, shows geological evidence of water erosion that would require rainfall patterns that haven't existed in Egypt since the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, suggesting the structure might be significantly older than the 4th dynasty pharaohs to whom it's traditionally attributed, which would make it roughly contemporary with Göbekli Tepe and raise profound questions about what kind of civilization existed in North Africa during that period, and whether the dynastic Egyptians we know from historical records were themselves inheritors of an earlier tradition, rather than originators. Gunung Padang in Indonesia presents similar chronological problems, with carbon dating of materials from the deepest layers suggesting construction dates as early as 25,000 BCE. Though these claims remain highly controversial, and many mainstream archaeologists reject them as methodologically flawed, yet the pattern of resistance to early dates for sophisticated construction appears repeatedly across the discipline and raises the uncomfortable question of whether academic consensus sometimes serves more to protect established narratives than to pursue truth wherever the evidence leads. The resistance to accepting that primitive peoples could achieve sophisticated results reflects deep assumptions about progress and development that might say more about our own cultural biases than about actual human capabilities. Because we want civilization to begin recently enough that we can trace its development through incremental steps, each building logically on the previous one, rather than confronting the possibility that complex knowledge and monumental construction might have emerged, flourished, and disappeared multiple times across the vast stretches of human prehistory, leaving only fragmentary traces that we dismiss as impossible because they don't fit the story we've constructed about ourselves. The symbolic connections between Göbekli Tepe and much later civilizations provide perhaps the most tantalizing hints that the site represents not the beginning, but the middle of a much longer story, because imagery and motifs that appear on the pillars resurface in Sumerian, Egyptian, and Indus Valley iconography thousands of years later, suggesting either an implausibly unlikely series of independent inventions or some form of cultural transmission that preserved specific symbols across millennia of cultural change and population movement. The vulture symbolism, for instance, appears prominently at Göbekli Tepe, in contexts that seem to associate the bird with death, corpse disposal, or the transition between earthly and spiritual realms. And similar associations appear in later Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures in ways that suggest not just universal human observation of vulture behavior, but specific symbolic meanings that were passed down through tradition, oral transmission, or some other form of cultural memory that maintain the connection between symbol and significance across the great gulf of time, separating the Neolithic from the Bronze Age. The serpent imagery presents another thread of symbolic continuity that runs from the Göbekli pillars through virtually every subsequent civilization in the region and beyond, always carrying associations with wisdom, danger, transformation, and hidden knowledge that seem far too consistent to be merely the result of different cultures, independently deciding that snakes represent similar things, and the possibility that these symbolic meanings originated in the cultural world of the Göbekli builders, becoming so deeply embedded in human mythological consciousness that they survive the collapse and forgetting of the civilization that created them, persisting as cultural DNA that continued to influence how later peoples thought about and represented the fundamental mysteries of existence. The cosmic serpent, the serpent of wisdom, the serpent as guardian of sacred knowledge. These themes appear globally in ways that might reflect either universal archetypes of human psychology or the scattered remnants of a symbolic system created by an earlier, more unified cultural sphere that subsequently fragmented into the diverse civilizations we know from recorded history. The architectural techniques visible at Göbekli Tepe also show up in later construction projects in ways that suggest transmission of practical knowledge across the centuries, because the ability to quarry, transport, and precisely position massive stones without metal tools or machinery had to be learned and practiced and refined over generations. And the sudden appearance of these capabilities in supposedly primitive populations who had no prior experience with such projects becomes more understandable if we assume they were inheriting techniques rather than inventing them, working within a tradition of megalithic construction that already had established methods for accomplishing what seems impossible to modern observers who forget that lack of technology doesn't mean lack of intelligence or ingenuity. The precision-cut stones of later civilizations, from the massive blocks of Baalbek to the perfectly fitted masonry of Cusco, demonstrate capabilities that seem to exceed what bronze or even early iron tools should be able to accomplish, leading to persistent speculation about lost technologies or forgotten techniques. And while much of this speculation veers into pseudoscience and ancient aliens, the core observation remains valid. Humans in the past sometimes accomplished things we cannot easily explain or replicate, suggesting that our understanding of the technical capabilities available to ancient peoples might be incomplete in significant ways. The deliberate organization of space at Göbekli Tepe, with its clear hierarchy of central and peripheral pillars, its consistent circular geometry, and its astronomical alignments, demonstrates planning capacity that requires abstract spatial reasoning and the ability to envision final results before beginning construction. Skills that supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers weren't supposed to possess because they lacked the settled life and specialized roles that we assume are prerequisites for such capabilities. Yet the evidence clearly shows they did possess them, forcing us to reconsider whether our developmental model of human social evolution might have cause and effect reversed. Perhaps it wasn't settled agricultural life that enabled complex planning and monumental construction, but rather the need to maintain and operate sites like Göbekli Tepe that drove the transition to sedentary existence. As populations found themselves increasingly tied to ceremonial centers that required continuous maintenance, seasonal observances, and the transmission of specialized knowledge about astronomical observations and ritual practices that couldn't be sustained by mobile groups, who might disperse for months at a time. The economic implications of maintaining Göbekli Tepe also challenge conventional models of Neolithic subsistence, because feeding the workers who quarried, transported, and erected the pillars, to say nothing of the specialists who carved the reliefs and the administrators who coordinated the various aspects of the project, would have required food surpluses on a scale that hunting and gathering typically cannot sustain, leading some researchers to propose that the site might have catalyzed the development of agriculture as communities sought more reliable and abundant food sources to support their monumental construction ambitions, essentially inverting the traditional narrative where agriculture enables monuments rather than monuments driving agriculture. This theory, while still speculative, has the virtue of explaining why domestication of wheat and other cereals appears to emerge in the same region and roughly the same time frame as the Megalithic sites suggesting that what we've been interpreting as a linear progression from foraging to farming to building might actually be a more complex feedback loop where the desire to maintain ceremonial centers and astronomical observatories created pressure to develop more efficient food production systems, which in turn enabled larger, more permanent settlements, which then generated the labor surpluses needed for even more ambitious construction projects. The question that emerges from examining what the builders of Göbekli Tepe actually created, the physical reality of stone and space and symbol they left behind, is not whether they were capable of sophisticated planning and execution. The evidence for that is literally carved in stone, but rather what they were planning and executing, what purpose all this effort was meant to serve, and whether that purpose was fundamentally religious in the way we understand the term, or whether it represented something our modern categories cannot easily accommodate, perhaps a fusion of astronomical observatory, calendar system, knowledge archive, communal gathering space, and mythological theatre that served simultaneously practical and symbolic functions in ways that our modern separation of secular and sacred, scientific and religious, cannot adequately capture. The architecture itself might be the message, with the physical arrangement of stones encoding information about cosmic cycles, seasonal patterns, and the relationship between earth and sky in a format that doesn't require literacy or even language, creating a monument that functions as a three-dimensional book readable by anyone who learns its grammar of stone and shadow, position and alignment, symbol and space, ensuring that essential knowledge survives even when the civilization that created it does not. Which brings us back to the question of what knowledge the builders deemed essential enough to preserve in this most permanent and public of formats, and whether any trace of that knowledge survives in the world today, perhaps transformed beyond recognition, but still present, still influencing how we think about time and space and our place in the cosmos, still whispering truths we've forgotten how to hear. The most haunting question posed by Göbekli Tepe is not how people without cities or agriculture managed to build something so sophisticated, nor even what knowledge they were trying to preserve in stone and symbol, but rather why that knowledge died, why the capabilities evident in those precisely carved pillars and astronomically aligned circles failed to compound into the kind of technological civilization we would recognize. Why the trajectory from hunter-gatherers who could move 16-ton stones with apparent confidence led not upward toward metallurgy and mathematics and written language, but sideways, and eventually downward into simpler agricultural societies that had to slowly, painfully rediscover or reinvent capabilities their distant ancestors had possessed 11,000 years earlier. This question cuts to the heart of our assumptions about progress and cultural evolution, challenging the comfortable notion that knowledge naturally accumulates across generations, like interest in a savings account, that each generation builds upon what came before in a steady march toward greater complexity and capability, when the evidence from Göbekli Tepe and its eventual abandonment suggests instead that forgetting is the natural state of human knowledge, that maintaining complex understanding across generations requires specific conditions and continuous effort, and that when those conditions deteriorate, or that effort falters, civilizations don't just stagnate, but actively regress, losing in a few generations what took centuries to develop. The brutal mathematics of cultural transmission reveals why this forgetting happens with such inexorable regularity throughout human history. Because knowledge doesn't exist as some abstract essence floating in the collective consciousness, but resides in individual human minds. each of which contains only a tiny fraction of the total understanding possessed by their civilization. And when those individuals die, without successfully transferring their specific expertise to the next generation, that knowledge dies with them, and the process of dying without transfer happens far more easily than we like to admit, because genuine mastery of complex skills requires years or decades of intensive practice under the guidance of someone who has already achieved that mastery, creating a chain of apprenticeship and mentorship that's exquisitely vulnerable to disruption by war, disease, economic collapse, or simply demographic bad luck, where a master craftsman dies before finding or fully training a worthy successor. The Göbekli builders would have faced this problem in extreme form, because if they were indeed working with inherited knowledge from an earlier, more advanced civilization, they were essentially trying to maintain technical capabilities whose theoretical foundations they might not fully understand, performing actions and following procedures that worked, but whose underlying principles had been lost in the catastrophe that necessitated the inheritance in the first place. Like a medieval monk copying Greek mathematical texts without understanding the proofs, preserving the forms, while the animating understanding evaporated into the dry air of ritual repetition. Consider the well-documented historical examples of this pattern, which appear with depressing regularity whenever we look closely at cultural continuity across generations, revealing that what we assume is natural progression is actually desperate struggle against entropy and forgetting that sometimes succeeds but often fails in ways that leave only fragmentary evidence of what was lost. The Polynesian navigators who colonized the Pacific Islands possessed sophisticated understanding of ocean currents, star positions, wave patterns, and wind dynamics that allowed them to traverse thousands of miles of open ocean in outrigger canoes, reaching tiny specks of land in the vast blue expanse through techniques that modern sailors equipped with GPS and radar struggle to replicate. Yet many Polynesian societies eventually lost these navigational capabilities after settling their islands, as the practical necessity of ocean voyaging decreased, and the years-long apprenticeships required to train master navigators became luxuries that communities focused on immediate survival could no longer afford, until the knowledge existed only in fragmentary form, remembered as legends of great voyages, but no longer practically accessible. The techniques reduced to stories about ancestors who could read the sea in ways their descendants could no longer comprehend. The Romans developed concrete formulations that produced structures of remarkable durability, with the Pantheon's dome still standing nearly 2,000 years after its construction. Yet the specific techniques for creating this Roman concrete, including the precise proportions of volcanic ash and lime and the method of layering and curing, were lost during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and medieval Europeans found themselves unable to replicate the engineering achievements visible in the ruins surrounding them, reduced to quarrying ancient buildings for construction materials like scavengers picking over the bones of giants, possessing neither the organizational capacity to undertake projects of comparable scale nor the technical knowledge to achieve comparable results even at smaller scales. The knowledge didn't disappear all at once in some dramatic bonfire, but rather eroded incrementally as the economic networks that supplied specialized materials dissolved, as the schools that trained engineers closed or simplified their curricula, as the institutional continuity that preserved complex procedures across generations fragmented into local traditions that retained forms but lost essential details, until what remained was cargo cult architecture that mimicked Roman styles without understanding Roman techniques, creating buildings that looked superficially similar but lacked the structural sophistication and longevity of their models. The pattern repeats itself with disturbing consistency across cultures and timescales, suggesting that the problem is not specific to particular societies, but rather reflects fundamental constraints on how complex knowledge propagates through human populations, constraints that become especially severe when populations decline, when social complexity decreases, when economic systems simplify, or when the attention and resources available for training the next generation get redirected toward immediate survival at the expense of long-term cultural transmission. The Damascus steel produced in the Middle East between approximately 1100 and 1700 CE exhibited properties that modern metallurgists still struggle to fully understand or replicate, with a distinctive wavy pattern and an ability to hold exceptionally sharp edges that made Damascus blades legendary throughout the medieval world. Yet the specific techniques for producing this steel were lost by the 18th century, possibly because the particular ore sources required were exhausted, possibly because the mastersmiths died during periods of warfare or plague without fully training successors, possibly because economic changes made the years-long apprenticeships required to master the technique economically unsustainable, or, most likely, some combination of all these factors creating a cascade where the loss of one element in the complex web of knowledge, materials, and social organization caused the entire system to unravel. The builders of Göbekli Tepe would have confronted these same dynamics in perhaps even more acute form, because if they were maintaining inherited knowledge from a collapsed predecessor civilization, they were already starting from a position of partial understanding, already working with fragmentary traditions whose full context had been lost, already 1 or 2 generations removed from the people who truly understood the principles underlying the techniques. And under those circumstances, the continued transmission of complex knowledge becomes extraordinarily difficult, because you're asking people to faithfully preserve and transmit procedures whose rationale they don't fully grasp, to maintain standards of precision whose importance they can only take on faith, to invest enormous resources in projects whose ultimate purpose has become obscured by time and forgetting. This situation inevitably leads to simplification and eventual abandonment, not because the descendants are stupid or lazy, but because maintaining incompletely understood knowledge requires continuously convincing each generation that the effort and resources invested are justified by benefits that may no longer be apparent. And that argument becomes progressively harder to make as the gap between effort required and benefit perceived grows wider with each passing generation. The archaeological evidence from the region shows exactly this pattern of gradual simplification playing out over the millennia, following Göbekli Tepe's construction and eventual burial, with later structures showing progressively less architectural ambition, smaller stones, cruder carving, and simpler symbolic programs. Not because later peoples were less intelligent or capable in absolute terms, but because the specific combination of knowledge, resources, social organization, and cultural priorities that enabled the original construction could not be sustained across the generations, especially as climate changes following the Younger Dryas created new challenges and opportunities that redirected human attention and effort toward developing agriculture, domesticating animals, and establishing permanent settlements organized around food production rather than monumental construction. The transition to agriculture, far from being an unambiguous improvement in human welfare, actually involved significant trade-offs, including poorer nutrition, increased disease burden, greater social inequality, and more intensive labor compared to hunting and gathering, Yet once communities committed to agricultural subsistence, they became locked into that system because the larger populations that agriculture supported couldn't be sustained by returning to foraging, creating a ratchet effect where societies could move toward greater dependence on agriculture but couldn't easily move back, even if agricultural life proved less satisfying or more precarious than the lifeways it replaced. The cognitive dimension of this forgetting deserves particular attention because modern research in psychology and neuroscience reveals that we systematically overestimate our own understanding of how things work, experiencing what psychologists call the illusion of explanatory depth, where we believe we comprehend complex systems until asked to actually explain them in detail, at which point we discover that our understanding is far more superficial than we realized, consisting mainly of familiarity with surface features and confidence in our ability to figure things out if necessary, rather than genuine grasp of underlying principles and mechanisms. This illusion operates at both individual and cultural levels, meaning that societies can collectively believe they understand and could replicate the achievements of their ancestors, when in fact they've lost crucial elements of the knowledge required, only discovering the loss when crisis or curiosity prompts them to actually attempt replication, and they find themselves unable to achieve what their grandparents managed routinely. And by that point, the knowledge may be irrecoverable because the last people who truly understood have died, and all that remains are partial accounts, fragmentary techniques, and the archaeological evidence of capabilities that can be observed but no longer reproduced. The decision by the Göbekli builders to bury their magnificent complex, rather than representing abandonment in the conventional sense, might actually reflect sophisticated understanding of this problem of knowledge decay, and the recognition that attempting to maintain incompletely understood systems across generations carries its own risks and costs that may exceed the benefits, especially if the knowledge has become detached from practical application and exists mainly as ritual obligation that drains resources without producing proportional returns. The careful, systematic burial suggests intentionality rather than defeat, perhaps representing a conscious choice to preserve the structures in protected form rather than allowing them to decay slowly through neglect or be destroyed gradually through partial maintenance that lacked full understanding, essentially choosing to create a time capsule rather than presiding over the slow corruption of traditions they could no longer properly sustain. Gambling that deliberate burial would preserve more than natural decay, and hoping that distant descendants might someday possess both the archaeological techniques to excavate carefully and the intellectual framework to ask meaningful questions about what they found. This interpretation casts the burial of Göbekli Tepe not as failure but as a form of success, an acknowledgement that the inheritance protocol had served its purpose as well as could be expected under the circumstances, and that continuing to maintain the site actively would require resources and organizational capacity that the population could no longer sustain, making strategic burial the most responsible option available to people who recognize their own limitations while still hoping to preserve something for the future, much like how we might choose to carefully store valuable items we cannot currently use, rather than keeping them in active circulation where they might be damaged or lost through mishandling. The fact that we have discovered and excavated the site 11,000 years later validates this choice to some degree, proving that burial did indeed preserve the structures more effectively than abandonment would have. Though the tragic irony remains that we can see what they built without fully understanding what it meant or what knowledge they were trying to preserve, succeeding in recovering the medium, while the message remains tantalizingly opaque. The broader lesson that emerges from examining why knowledge dies despite the best efforts to preserve it, is that cultural transmission is not a passive process of receiving what previous generations hand down, but an active struggle against entropy that requires continuous effort, institutional support, economic surplus, and most crucially, convincing each generation that maintaining complex knowledge is worth the investment of time and resources required. And when any of these elements fails, forgetting begins immediately and accelerates quickly, as the living memory of how and why things were done gives way to rote performance of inherited procedures whose rationale has been lost, and eventually even the procedures themselves are abandoned, as each generation simplifies what it inherited to match its reduced capacity or changed priorities, until what remains is only the faintest echo of what was, visible perhaps in persistent symbols or mythological themes or architectural forms that no one quite remembers how to use properly, but that continue to exert fascination precisely because they gesture toward knowledge that was once held but is now lost, whispering that we are not the first to know things and will not be the last to forget them. The uncomfortable truth that emerges from examining Göbekli Tepe and the civilization that built it, then deliberately buried it, then gradually forgot it existed, is that we might be standing in exactly the same position relative to our own accumulated knowledge as those builders stood relative to whatever they inherited from their predecessors, which is to say we might be users rather than understanders, inheritors rather than inventors, beneficiaries of a complex web of knowledge whose full depth and interconnection we don't grasp because we've grown up surrounded by technologies and ideas we accept as simply how the world works, without ever questioning where they came from, or how fragile the conditions are that allow them to persist. Consider for a moment how much of the technology you use daily you could actually build from scratch if civilization collapsed tomorrow, and you found yourself with raw materials and time, but no supply chains, no specialized manufacturing equipment, no technical manuals, and no community of experts to consult. And you begin to realize that your relationship to modern technology is not fundamentally different from how a cargo cult relates to the airplane. You can operate it, you can recognize when it's broken, you might even be able to perform basic maintenance if you follow the instructions carefully. But the deep understanding of principles and processes that would allow you to recreate it from first principles exists somewhere in the collective knowledge of civilization, but probably not in your individual mind, making you entirely dependent on systems of transmission and preservation that you trust implicitly but rarely examine. The parallels between our situation and what the Göbekli builders might have faced become especially unsettling when you consider that the original civilizations we learn about in school, Sumer with its cuneiform writing and complex mathematics, Egypt with its pyramids and sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the Indus Valley with its urban planning and standardized weights and measures, all appear in the archaeological record with suspicious suddenness, emerging not gradually through observable stages of development, but rather springing into existence almost fully formed, as though the people who created these civilizations already knew what they were trying to accomplish, and simply needed to marshal the resources and labor to implement plans that existed in some form before the first stones were laid or the first tablets inscribed. The standard explanation attributes this apparent suddenness to gaps in the archaeological record, to the accident of preservation that might have destroyed or buried the evidence of earlier developmental stages. Yet the pattern repeats across too many supposedly independent civilizations to be entirely explained by coincidence. suggesting instead the possibility that these cultures were themselves inheritors, building on foundations laid by predecessors whose names and stories have been lost, but whose influence persists in the surprisingly sophisticated knowledge that appears at the very beginning of what we call civilization. The symbols and motifs that recur across geographically separated cultures with no obvious contact or communication between them present one of the most tantalizing hints that we might be inheriting knowledge without recognizing the source. Because certain images and concepts, the cosmic serpent, the world tree, the flood myth, the divine twins, the descent into the underworld, the sacred mountain, appear in cultures from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from India to Scandinavia, in forms too specific and too consistent to be easily explained by universal archetypes of human psychology or independent invention responding to similar environmental challenges. The conventional academic explanation invokes diffusion and cultural contact through trade routes and migration, which certainly happened and certainly transmitted ideas across vast distances, yet this explanation struggles to account for similarities between cultures that existed on different continents, separated by oceans that supposedly couldn't be crossed with available technology, forcing us to choose between accepting that ancient peoples had greater maritime capabilities than we've credited them with, or acknowledging that some of these symbolic systems might predate the geographical separation of populations, representing inheritance from a time when human cultures were more interconnected than our current models allow for. Possibly because coastlines and land bridges existed in different configurations before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, drowning the evidence of where people actually lived and traveled. The practical knowledge embedded in agricultural practices, astronomical observations, and architectural techniques that appears across early civilizations also shows patterns of similarity that hint at common origins or at least common sources of inherited understanding, because the domestication of crops involves sophisticated understanding of plant genetics, selective breeding, and ecological relationships that supposedly took thousands of years to develop through trial and error. Yet multiple crops appear to have been domesticated in different regions within relatively narrow timeframes after the end of the Younger Dryas, suggesting either an implausibly unlikely simultaneous invention or the application of knowledge about plant cultivation that survived from earlier periods and was reapplied when climate conditions stabilized sufficiently to make agriculture viable again. The astronomical knowledge visible in megalithic structures across the world, from Stonehenge to Nabta Playa to the alignments of Angkor Wat, demonstrates understanding of celestial cycles, precession of the equinoxes, and the relationship between earthly and cosmic time that supposedly required centuries of careful observation and mathematical analysis. Yet this knowledge appears already developed in cultures we consider primitive or early stage, as though they inherited the observations and simply implemented them in stone, rather than having to discover the patterns themselves through patient watching of the skies across generations. The architectural sophistication visible in the oldest layers of many ancient sites presents perhaps the most direct challenge to our narrative of gradual development, because the conventional archaeological assumption that cruder construction indicates earlier construction and more refined technique indicates later development runs into uncomfortable contradictions when applied to actual evidence, where the oldest megalithic structures often show the most impressive stonework, while later additions and modifications demonstrate progressively simpler techniques and less precise execution, suggesting not progress, but regression, not learning, but forgetting, not innovation, but increasingly unsuccessful attempts to maintain or imitate capabilities whose full mastery had been lost. The massive stones at Baalbek, some weighing over 800 tons and positioned with precision that modern engineering struggles to explain or replicate, form the foundation for Roman temples built on top of them. And while the temples are impressive in their own right, they represent a completely different scale and technique of construction than the megalithic platform they rest upon, raising the question of whether the Romans built on top of much earlier foundations, or whether they were consciously attempting to add their own contributions to a site whose original builders they recognized as having achieved something beyond their own capabilities. The mystery of how these massive stones were quarried, transported, and positioned with such precision without metal tools, without wheels, without modern machinery, and apparently without the accumulated experience of earlier projects to learn from, has generated endless speculation and increasingly exotic theories. Yet, the most parsimonious explanation might simply be that the people who accomplished these feats possessed knowledge and techniques that we've lost. Not because they were more intelligent than us, but because they focused their intellectual and practical energies on different problems than we do, developing sophisticated understanding of leverage, friction, sound resonance, and material properties through direct experimentation and apprenticeship systems that transmitted practical knowledge across generations, until some disruption in cultural continuity broke the chain of transmission, leaving only the monuments as mute testimony to capabilities that could be achieved but can no longer be explained. The fact that we cannot easily replicate these achievements despite our supposedly superior technology and understanding should prompt humility about our own knowledge and recognition that different doesn't mean inferior, that cultures can be sophisticated in ways that don't align with our measures of sophistication, and that the inability to explain how something was done is not evidence that it couldn't have been done, but rather evidence of the limits of our own understanding and imagination. The modern phenomenon of rapidly losing knowledge, despite having unprecedented technologies for recording and preserving information, should serve as a warning about how easily forgetting happens even under seemingly ideal conditions, because we can no longer perform calculations without computers, can no longer navigate without GPS, can no longer remember phone numbers or addresses, because our devices remember them for us, can no longer repair most of the objects we use daily, because they're designed to be replaced rather than fixed, can no longer understand the supply chains that feed us, or the systems that power our homes, or the networks that connect us to each other, having outsourced so much understanding to specialized experts and automated systems that the average person's practical knowledge of how the world actually works has shrunk to a tiny fraction of what their great-grandparents knew about the functioning of their considerably simpler world. The irony of living in an age of information abundance while experiencing knowledge atrophy should make us skeptical of our own narrative about progress and accumulation, because we're accumulating data at exponential rates while simultaneously losing understanding of basic principles and practical skills at rates we rarely acknowledge, because the loss happens incrementally and invisibly, noticed only when some disruption forces us to confront how dependent we've become on systems we don't understand and cannot maintain without the elaborate infrastructure of modern technological civilization. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a small-scale preview of how quickly complex systems can break down and how rapidly specialized knowledge becomes inaccessible when supply chains fail and experts cannot easily travel or collaborate, revealing that our vaunted global civilization is far more fragile than we like to imagine, dependent on an intricate web of just-in-time delivery, international cooperation, and institutional continuity that can be severely disrupted by relatively minor perturbations compared to the catastrophic scenarios that would actually threaten civilizational collapse. And if a respiratory virus can cause this much disruption to our systems of knowledge production and transmission, what would happen in the event of truly serious challenges like nuclear war, asteroid impact, supervolcanic eruption, or the cascading failures of climate change, interacting with resource depletion and political instability? The uncomfortable answer is that we would likely experience exactly the same pattern of knowledge loss that we've observed throughout history, with complex understanding degrading rapidly as the conditions necessary to maintain and transmit it disappeared, and within a few generations, the survivors would find themselves trying to operate technologies they couldn't repair, following procedures they didn't fully understand, and gradually simplifying their knowledge to match their reduced circumstances until they reached some sustainable equilibrium between what they knew and what their environment and social organization could support. The symbols and ideas we consider fundamental to our civilization — democracy, human rights, scientific method, mathematical reasoning — exist not as eternal truths, but as fragile cultural achievements that must be actively transmitted to each generation through education systems, institutional practices, and social norms that require continuous effort and resources to maintain. And history shows repeatedly that these can be lost or corrupted remarkably quickly when the conditions that sustain them deteriorate, with societies regressing from enlightenment to authoritarianism, from rationalism to superstition, from universal principles to tribal loyalties, not because people forget the words, but because they forget or abandon the deep understanding and commitment that made the words meaningful rather than merely rhetorical. The builders of Göbekli Tepe might have faced exactly this problem with whatever knowledge they inherited, watching as each generation retained the forms but lost more of the substance, performing rituals whose original meaning had faded, maintaining practices whose rationale was no longer understood, until finally the decision to bury the site represented acknowledgement that the knowledge could no longer be maintained in living practice, and the best hope was to preserve it in frozen form for potential future recovery. The question that should haunt us as we stand at what might be the peak of human technological achievement is whether we are creating or merely inheriting, whether our civilization represents genuine understanding or elaborate cargo cult, whether the knowledge we possess is actually ours in any meaningful sense, or whether we're just the current operators of systems whose principles we've largely forgotten, coasting on the momentum of earlier discoveries and inventions while gradually losing the deep comprehension that would allow us to rebuild if everything broke down. And most disturbingly, whether we would even recognize that we're forgetting, because the illusion of explanatory depth operates so effectively that we feel we understand things we actually don't, trusting that someone somewhere must know how it all works, even when the evidence suggests that the knowledge might be more distributed and fragile than we imagine, existing not in any single place or mind, but in the network of specialists and institutions and documentation systems that could unravel faster than we think possible if the right combination of stresses hit at the wrong moment, the final, most unsettling possibility that Göbekli Tepe whispers across the 11,000 years since its burial is that we are not the first technological civilization to rise on this planet, that the cycle of building and forgetting, of inheriting and losing, of encoding knowledge in monuments and symbols that outlast the understanding they were meant to preserve, has happened before and might happen again, that what we call the beginning of civilization might actually be a restart after an earlier collapse whose evidence was erased by rising seas, grinding glaciers, and the simple passage of time that turns everything to dust except the hardest stone and the most persistent symbols. And that if we want to avoid becoming the next civilization that future archaeologists puzzle over, wondering how we accomplished what we did and why we couldn't sustain it, we need to recognize that knowledge is not naturally cumulative, but naturally dissipative. Not automatically progressive, but automatically regressive. Unless conscious effort maintains the conditions for transmission, and that the difference between being remembered as the ancients who knew things we've forgotten and being remembered as the moderns who should have known better might simply be whether we choose to preserve what matters in forms that can survive our own forgetting, or whether we trust too much in systems too fragile to outlast the inevitable disruptions that time and chance bring to every civilization, no matter how permanent it feels from the inside.